Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
We wanted to try to unpack the archetype of redemption this week, and I will raise my hand and say that this was my request that we discuss this on the podcast. I wanted to talk about it because it's something that was on my mind as I work with a client. And so I think we wanted to start our discussion of this topic, grounding it in this clinical example, which I will share I have significantly disguised. So consider this a kind of fictionalized clinical vignette. This is a young woman who is 22 years old, and she entered my practice being quite suicidal because in the course of her undergraduate career, she had had an incident, a very traumatic incident. A friend of hers had committed suicide, and it was very distressing to her. And subsequent to her friend's suicide, she went through a period where she was drinking a lot, she was using drugs, and she was also sleeping around indiscriminately. And in the course of that, she contracted herpes. So of all of that stuff, she regrets it all now. She feels that it really pulled her off course. You know, her grades suffered. But for her, the biggest, hardest thing is the herpes, which she feels very stained by this. She regrets it greatly. She often says things that she, wishes she could go back and turn back the clock and erase the night that it happened. And she really feels like the way forward to finding a satisfying life partnership has been blocked to her. That she can't now date in the same way that she would have dated. She feels like she's kind of damaged goods, that she can't be with another person lest she pass the herpes on. So she feels very blocked from pursuing relationships. And essentially, she's in the archetype of what I think of as the fall from grace, a kind of violation of original wholeness. In that space, she feels very bereft and full of grief. I'm finding that what's constellating in me is that I am holding the archetype of redemption for her. Now, it hasn't even necessarily been articulated in the work, but I'm finding that that is what is constellating in me, that there's the possibility for redemption, and that is the corollary to the fall.
I'm thinking about this from the great archetypal story in Genesis of Adam and Eve, and how innocence, we start out with a kind of innocence that gets really penetrated and disillusioned. Here she was in college and has this traumatic experience of an untimely shock of a death that she then attempts to flee into a life of pleasure and drugs and avoid that feeling. And then here is this stain of having contracted herpes. And that, it's not dissimilar to Adam and Eve being cast out of the Garden of Eden. And the question is, and then what?
Yeah, this can't be undone.
Yes.
It will never go back to the original state of wholeness. Mm-hmm. There is no do-over. And so then what? And we all have moments like this. It may not look like this, but we all reached a point at some time in our lives, often around this age too, I think, when we realized that the original wholeness had been violated and innocence had been lost.
I find myself wanting to think about the idea of original wholeness. I mean, it's a big idea. There's so many images that can swim around that. So in psychoanalytic literature, the original wholeness is the infant consciousness, where we kind of come into consciousness in those first 1 to 2 years. We naturally both feel and exhibit all possible behaviors, all possible qualities. Even some of the interesting research with newborns, once they start vocalizing, is that newborns will make all the possible sounds of all known languages. And that it's as they're tuning in to their native tongue, where they're born, as the brain begins to put away certain sounds that won't be used and differentiate a small set of sounds which will be useful to learn their language. Everything's possible in the beginning. And little children have, they feel rage, they can feel murderous and violent and gleeful and, everything under the sun. They'll try every kind of behavior. So everything's possible there. And over time, they are acculturated. They're told what's not acceptable, what is acceptable, what's punishable. And this process of shaping and, in a sense, cutting away more and more of the primal wholeness where everything is possible into a, reasonably so, a truncated and acceptable version of oneself. And that corresponds with the birth of consciousness and choice and adaptation and awareness of other people. And yet, something's lost.
Well, there is that process, that we often call differentiation from the original kind of grandiosity and innocence of an infant. All of a sudden, mom doesn't appear the very moment that the baby starts to whimper. Mom starts to say, sorry, you have to put your shoes on to go outside. That gratification is not always possible, and it is in the service of ego development, which then takes on its own kind of innocence and a kind of grandiosity of what I want and what I can do and what I think life is like, which relegates shadow, to the unconscious. And later on, as in your example, Lisa, that's often what gets penetrated, is now there is a call in the fall to say, oh my God, I somehow have to integrate this thing that has happened to me that I regret, that cannot be undone.
This notion of loss of original wholeness or innocence, of course, is very archetypal. And I'm reminded of the, Robert Frost poem, Nothing Gold Can Stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold, her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour, then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay.
Perfect.
Perfect and so moving.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this almost archetypal grief that we kind of adore this idea of the golden dawn of things and the inevitability of the progression of loss of that pristine fantasy or vision.
And this applies to everything, right? Relationships, a new job, a new career. There's always that loss.
A new car. I mean, like getting really, you have the new car smell. It's like it's been first issued from the great, godlike factory of Toyota. And there is a feeling of the pristineness of it. And like the first time you look over and your kid's like, puking on the, fabric there, and you're like, it's like the whole thing has been ruined.
Yes,
from the pristineness.
That is the flavor.
It partakes of that archetype, even in a silly way.
So isn't that the perfect contrast with that kicker line from Faust of, so Eden comes to grief?
Yes.
Of that there it is, that connection with an archetypal core. Even if it's your nice new car getting stained, nothing gold can stay. We have to deal with this over and over again.
Yep. It is archetypal. It is archetypal. And as with I think the thing that's so poignant for me about my young client is, when you're in it, it feels so damning and irrevocable, and you're so stricken, and you're really suffering it.
And that suffering itself is part of the loss. So we have to open up the category of sin, because, there's the wholeness, then there's the archetype of sin, and then there's this repercussion, and then what do we do with the repercussions? So I think that for most of us, the word sin is so packed with cultural energy. And a lot of what people initially think of as sin is that somehow, we are not satisfying the superego of the culture, meeting what the church says we should do, or the Boy Scout oath and motto, for that matter, that the culture tells us what it approves of, which we call right, and that tells us what's wrong, and then that becomes sin. So, interestingly enough, sin is also an archery term. So anytime you don't hit the bullseye, you've sinned. So in essence, there's this idea that anytime you don't absolutely identify with and demonstrate the cultural value, the superego's value, then you've kind of missed the mark, and you have to go through some kind of a compensation around that. But another kind of suffering another kind of sin, rather, is just suffering itself. That there's something even more primal, even in the infant mind, that as we're moving along in the primal unity is also associated with pleasure, or at least homeostasis. So anytime the child actually suddenly becomes frightened and or hurts itself, anything that's around the negative experience is also associated with badness and sin. And that's where things become really primal. I've had a painful outcome, so this must be associated with evil and sin. And as we bring much more consciousness to that, we begin to, one, question, is there actually value in things that have brought us pain? And later on in most theologies, what emerges is this process of conscious suffering as part of this redemption. And the redemption is a movement towards consciousness.
Yeah, suffering is obviously a big part of this, right? If we're going to kind of outline the cycle, we might say there's original wholeness, and then there's sin or the fall, and then there's suffering, which itself can be redemptive, or it can lead to redemption.
I also like the distinction that you're making, Joseph, between sin that is the result of one's own choice, archetypally to take the bite of the old apple, and suffering that simply is a loss of innocence that feels undeserved. I didn't do anything wrong, which of course infants experience, and it's inherent in the story of Job, of that he was a good and godly man who did obey at least all the cultural rules around what godliness, righteousness should look like.
But he's saying, I'm a good boy. Why am I being punished? Why should I have any suffering in my life if I'm following all the rules? Which, by the way, lots of modern people have that attitude.
And that is, to me, inherent in the idea of the loss of innocence. That cultural rules, the rules of superego of, wash your hands before you eat, stand in line, raise your hand before you speak, those two, those aren't necessarily, all the rules that there are.
It's like our expectations for how the world should be become violated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in that, the possibility of becoming more aware and a more adult in a sense. Because anytime we just believe that if we follow these 10, steps, these 10 corollaries, then everything will be easy and fun and pleasurable and safe. And that's a very simplistic view of the world.
I'm also thinking about the fall and therefore redemption as an experience of being cast out or separated from our connection from, let's say, God or the self, if you will. That this experience of separateness from that energy. And I have what may be a silly story from my personal life, but somehow it was very big for me at the time, and I've never forgotten it. And it dates back to when I was probably 3 or 4. And it had been raining out, and I had gone out in rain boots and stomped around in puddles. And then I came into the house and I took my boots off, and my boots were filled with muddy water. And in doing so, the muddy water spilled all over the wall and left a muddy stain. And something about that just hit me hard. I remember many, many years later now, I can see it. I can see the muddy stain on the wall, and just something about the way that hit me, I crumpled. And I had this feeling that I had besmirched the wall forever. And I must have become very distraught, and I suppose I started to cry. And my mother, thank goodness at that moment said, what's wrong? What are you crying about? And I said, I ruined the wall. And she said, oh, that's nothing. And she went and got a sponge and wiped it right up. And so it was a profound experience of being cast out and then being redeemed.
Right. That is exactly it. There was something in your child consciousness that all of a sudden had an awareness of the fall.
Yes,
of
exactly.
Now there is the stain on the wall, and it was your mother, the good mother, that she really must have been, who carried out the function of redemption. She made a bridge.
Yes.
Between the horrible, ineradicable stain that I'm comparing to, the stain that your client feels.
Yeah.
And a restoration of the world and right order.
Could still be accepted and loved.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and to me it brings up the idea of virtue, that the wall had a certain kind of perfection, which is really what virtue means. And that somehow violating its pristine, perfect state had diminished its virtue, and that archetypally you could feel that, and that the mother's ability to wipe that clean and return it to its whiteness restored its virtue. It's all so deep and primal, the fact that as a kid you're not thinking in those terms, but you still could feel it, tells us that this really transcends systems.
I'm also thinking about your child self stomping around in the mud and the puddles, that might be where the guilt was later, that your wildness, and of course mud has all these archetypal associations to it, the dirt of the earth, the primal matter, all this beneath the child's comprehension, but nevertheless, it's there. There's the shadow. And I was wantonly crashing around in the puddles and filled my boots with muddy water.
Yes, I think you're right, Deb.
First encounter with shadow. And the price gets steeper as we grow up, as your client has discovered that she wanted to escape from and assuage the horrible feelings of her trauma and drown her sorrows in alcohol and have the freedom and wantonness of sexual encounter. And the price she had to pay was very different in degree, but maybe not in kind, from what you experienced in your rain boots at age 4. And what do we do with our shadow? What do we do when we fall? And there is no do-over, and we are forced into feeling outcast over something where we feel we have a stain. We are tainted.
Well, I think the first thing is to really analyze the seduction of whiteness, the seduction of virtue. That if somehow we have a virtue complex, this idea of whiteness and virtuousness is looming so large in the psyche that it's speaking to all of these shifts away from whiteness. So there's sex, so I can never go back to being a virgin again. That is a lost opportunity.
I thought you still were.
I am. I'm a virgin to some experiences that are on my bucket list. Yeah, and then, just as we said, not only that, but to have an STD. We could say that, it's a kind of strange, dark initiation into learning that in the midst of all of the pleasure and excitement of a sexual experience, that there's a whole other, sub-world of microbes and viruses and bacteria, that are also tagging along in all of these lived experiences. So it's an initiation into these multiple levels of events that are happening. And as we said, right now, medicine can change. Maybe this whiteness can be restored. But right now, this sense that some changes are permanent and the fantasy of whiteness can't be satisfied.
I'm this calls up a story that I've loved, and you touched on it before, Joseph, of the Velveteen Rabbit, and who was white. And then he gets tattered and stained and so on, and is finally outcast. He's thrown on the heap of things to be burned because he's germ-ridden now. And then the garden fairy, this sort of magical introduction of the redemptive force, changes him finally into an ordinary rabbit. So his whiteness is not restored. He's a little brown rabbit. He's very ordinary. And yet he has life. He has wholeness. And that's what Jung says over and over again, is that the journey is toward wholeness.
Right. Not perfection.
Not perfection. We're not looking to restore whiteness.
Right. And that's redemption, like wholeness, the achievement of wholeness, which is always only approximate, right? But that is redeeming.
And it's also an acceptance of ordinariness.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he becomes. The glory is that he becomes fully alive as a little brown garden rabbit, just like all the other rabbits. But he's more alive, he's more whole, he's not white.
And ordinariness is not perfect. The thing about the original wholeness is that there's a perfection there. And this is one of the things that I see in the psychology of my young client, is that there's a tendency toward perfectionism and a feeling that if something isn't perfect, then it's ruined.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an invitation to embrace ordinariness and wholeness and eschew perfection.
Yeah, and specialness. What really falls here is the hope and the dream of being, pure and being special versus accepting what is tainted, what has fallen, what is now ordinary.
And that is experienced in such a way that it cannot be denied. Because we can go through all kinds of mental gymnastics to think that our whiteness, our virtue has been, restored to us, and we no longer have had experiences that we have. But one of the accommodations, one of the values that allows us to rest, to tolerate the loss of virtue is humility. And I love that the word humble comes from the same root as the word humus, which means earth. To be humble for this client, for all of us, is to be able to feel that we are creatures of the earth, that we are interacting with all of these things. In the case of your client, unfortunately, even these microbes, which we have to share this earth with, and that we have to negotiate with that. And in telling the truth about the earth and the soil and our bodies, that allows us to tolerate the loss of virtue.
And I want to just build on this idea about perfection and accepting imperfection and the humility that is required for that. There's a quote from Jung that makes it clear the importance of this in establishing relationships. So I just want to read that. He says recognition of the shadow, on the other hand, leads to the modesty we need in order to acknowledge imperfection. And it is just this conscious recognition and consideration that are needed whenever a human relationship is to be established. A human relationship is not based on differentiation and perfection, for these only emphasize the differences or call forth the exact opposite. It is based rather on imperfection, on what is weak, helpless, and in need of support, the very ground and motive for dependence.
So I want to bring another differentiation into the conversation, as loving and as warm as we just were. So one model that I think we're moving around is this idea of what are the rules and breaking the rules, and how do we deal with the fact that we have transgressed what's considered normal or virtuous. But I want to also shift over to something that Jung wrote a lot about in his reflections on Gnosticism. It's a very complicated thesis that he unpacks, but what he begins to say is that the primal unity of a human being with all of our capacities to respond and creativity, as part of splitting off parts of ourselves, we project them into the environment. We project them onto other people, circumstances, political groups, on and on and on. So in projection, what we're doing is we are taking a quality in ourselves and we are imaginally inserting it or associating it with, let's say, another person. And then we keep reaffirming that imaginal, insertion into the other person. And then we begin to find evidence, even if it's tiny, nuanced evidence, that it lives over there. And so my image of myself becomes smaller and tighter, because over here, I have just a small basket of virtuous fantasies, and that all the other things have been projected out. So Jung would say that the first sin is actually the splitting off and projection of components of ourselves, and then all the suffering behaviors that ensue both internally and culturally to continue to reinforce that splitting process. The redemptive process then for Jung is this psychological maturity where we come into the knowledge, first theoretically, that this happens, that this is a stage actually of ego building, and that once we are initiated into knowledge of that, then we go on to this hunt to find parts of ourselves, or in Gnosticism, sparks of Sophia, sparks of, quote unquote, the divine that have been trapped into matter and circumstances, and reclaim them as being valuable and reclaim them as being parts of ourselves.
Yeah, and just to build on that a little bit, that Gnostic attitude is very similar, according to Jung, to the alchemical attitude. He says in volume 12, he says that the alchemical attitude, and man takes upon himself the duty of carrying out the redeeming opus, and attributes the state of suffering and consequent need of redemption to the anima mundi, imprisoned in matter. So it's very similar to what you're saying.
And I'm thinking about the alchemical process here and relating it to the ego development you talked of sublimatio, which I've likened to having sort of like a binocular kind of vision of one part is involved in experience, and we have our subjectivity. This is what I like, how I see the world. And another part has the seat up in the skybox, or like a bird can look down on what is below, see it more whole and see it more subjectively. So that then we have this kind of ability to see it both ways. And then I'm thinking, what about the ego's relationship to the transcendent? That there is something still greater than my ego and how I see things, which is what Jung called the self.
And I think that that is one of the boons that we gain when we can consciously we can consciously experience our suffering. That's one of the things that we get when we suffer, is an acknowledgement of how small our ego is and how we rest in relationship to something larger. That is part of the redemption of suffering, is the knowledge of that relationship.
So I think that acknowledging that there is a superordinate process going on, even in the midst of our human struggles, I think allows us both to feel mobilized, to feel held, to feel like we've got enough energy. But I want to drop back to this process of loss, sin, and redemption relative to Jung's model of projection. So, and we see this also in some myths and stories like Faust, Goethe's Faust, or Christopher Marlowe's play Faust, which is a little easier to kind of plow through. So we kind of start from the state where we think everything is fine, and we think we're rather wonderful and righteous and, on the path. And then all of a sudden these conflicts kind of happen, and these powerful forces, which are shadowy in our thinking, begin to pull us into kind of an interest in things that aren't congruent with our virtuous image of ourselves. So Faust, in the midst of this kind of incredible frustration that his studies can't give him everything he wants, comes into this relationship with this Mephistopheles, which is kind of the serpent in the garden, who whispers and says, there's other ways of, gaining information, and argues with Faust. And finally Faust says, fine, I'll sign a deal with the devil. And then what Faust does is he begins to descend into the world of experience and sex and power, and taking that for a moment into a human process. So let's say we're raised in a family, a church, a political system, and, we finally go to college and we have this sense of being very righteous, and we, have taken a purity pledge, and we have a little ring that says, I'm not going to have sex until I get married, because there's a rule that says I am more virtuous and more loved, if I do that, and many other kinds of beliefs that people might have. Then all of a sudden, all of these cut off parts of the psyche, sexuality, sensuality, love, relationship, power, all kinds of stuff, begin to clamor. And then we often have to go down into that world. We have to, or we're compelled to start being sexual, to start having relationships. Maybe you finally do cheat on a test for the first time. Maybe you have all kinds of transgressions that you experiment with, setting up an awful lot of conflicts inside of yourself. But also, by going into the shadow, you begin to realize, there's a part of me that really is like sex. And there's a part of me that likes being powerful, or there's a part of me that likes being tricky or conniving. And that all of these things are actually disowned parts of myself. And in disowning them, they're not terribly elegant because they've been kind of banished into the backwater. So part of the redemptive process that Jung particularly was interested in is to be able to own all of our impulses, and that many of which we have perhaps now experimented with, like Faust did, and to be able to examine on a deep level, what is my intention? What am I reaching for in that behavior? And is the behavior, or I would call the ritual, actually going to get me where I need to be? So often in the analytic container, what we ask of people who come in confessing their sins is, what's the direction you're going in? Because there's an impulse that's correct and restorative and redemptive. But is this the best way to get to this experience or this drive? And that's where the art, the alchemical art of separating out the dross from the gold, that every impulse in the shadow has gold, has a spark of Sophia, but it doesn't show up immediately like that. So for instance, your client who is highly promiscuous, all of us that may have had that stage of experience, in retrospect to go, I was really reaching for something that was legitimate. Mm-hmm. And perhaps it was human contact. Perhaps it was finding out what my body is. Maybe after a childhood of dissociation, being very promiscuous actually allowed me to experience myself in my flesh in a certain way. There are other kinds of needs that are deeply soulful. The question is right now, was being promiscuous actually the most effective method of being re-embodied? And the truth is, maybe it was. And we have to just live with that. And maybe if we had a mentor who understood what we were reaching for, there could have been even other more elegant ways of getting to that. But to thwart what you're going for would make you sick.
Yeah, I just want to say that this idea about sort of sin being that which the culture has decided is bad is certainly one of the ways of experiencing the fall from which we will then seek redemption. But I think there's also a way in which the fall can just feel like we've become alienated from ourselves. And that has a little different quality to it.
Oh, we've become alienated from what we have thought about ourselves.
Well, it can also feel like a self-betrayal.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think where I'm going here is building on Joseph's point about what is experience. We need to experience things in order to integrate them and not project them out. And then we are called in the course of development to not necessarily experience things concretely. Of, do I have to act out my sexual desires or my desire for 3 pieces of chocolate cake in order to experience it? Or can I find that hungry or desirous part of myself inside myself without having to physically act it out? And that is the call, in a way, I think, to a kind of redemption, of we don't concretize it, and neither do we try to repress it or suppress it or reject it, but we have an interior capability for finding our shadow selves.
And that goes to your idea of sublimatio, is that to take the concrete impulse, to allow it, in sublimation in chemistry, it's that a solid goes right into a vapor without passing through a liquid stage. So to take the concrete image of, I want to have sex all the time, and to allow it to translate into a kind of archetypal or a much larger drive, which transcends the particular behavior, is a form of redemption.
Yeah, I want to back up a little bit, Joseph, though, to a point that I think that you were making, which is there is a way that we have to sin before we can be redeemed. And this is a little bit of a paradox that's discussed in Christian theology at times. And it's, I think, kind of referenced in the parable of the prodigal son, that it's the prodigal son for whom the fatted calf is killed, because it's more significant somehow to sin and then be redeemed than to never have that original state of perfect wholeness violated. There's something transformative that happens in that state. And I'm thinking a literary example is coming to mind, actually, of Jean Valjean in Les Miserables. And it's been just like ages since I read it, so I'm really reaching here. But that beautiful scene where Jean Valjean steals the silver, I think, from the bishop, and then is caught, and the police come, bring him back, and the bishop says, "Oh no, I gave those to him," and that sets Jean Valjean on the rest of his course. It changes him. That moment of sort of divine understanding, compassion, and forgiveness, and how transformative and redemptive that is.
That's really beautiful. And it calls back to mind your experience in the rain with your muddy boots. Versus, to leapfrog back over to the prodigal son, there's the, quote, good son, unquote, who stays home and does everything that his father requires and never gets his feet dirty. He lives by cultural or collective rules, filial obedience. So usually our first encounters with shadow are going to be concrete.
Yes.
The prodigal son stuff, and you were the prodigal daughter after you came home and were redeemed for your splashing muddy water on the wall. We have to take it in first, I think, physically and concretely as our first way of experiencing things.
And that brings me back to a word, Joseph, that you used maybe 15 minutes ago, which was initiation. And I think that when we get our feet muddy, or we are the prodigal son, or we find ourselves with herpes at 22, we have become initiated. We have lost our innocence, and that is a loss, but we've gained something too. We have become initiated. We have become open to our own complexity and depth.
If we can use it. And that's the next call, is to return to and engage in a life that has shadow. And going back to Adam and Eve, and I always imagine, what did they do after they were booted out of the Garden of Eden? You know, if they don't know how to cook, they don't know how to hunt, they don't know how to make clothes, and yet they are called to live, and to live as fully and as capably as they can, versus what always seems to me a rather kind of anemic life in the garden. You know, shall we pick strawberries today? Or, you know, what do you think about looking for some green beans? So there's life in a whole new dimension that is now before you. Life in the ordinary, life as an ordinary person.
As an ordinary person, but I also think that these ancient myths of the fall, which many cultures have, are vestigial memories of the birth of the self-conscious mind, of the cortex, of the frontal lobe of the brain, that what was idyllic, perhaps, there was a time that human beings functioned purely on instinct. You know, the birds didn't have to trouble themselves about thinking about how to make a nest. You know, something in them knew how to make a nest, how to identify food. And there was this kind of very prescribed way of navigating the environment. But there's some mythic moment where human beings wake up and they realize they have choices, that they might respond to conditions in multiple different ways, in addition to what the body might want it to do. And that, of course, sets in motion all of the troubles of having lots of different choices and going against instinct.
It's a split too, right?
Yes, which is necessary for consciousness to grow. And then, of course, the story is resolved mythologically with the idea of the Mashiach, the Redeemer, who then somehow reignites humanity with this divine source so that human beings now return to a wholeness with awareness.
Right. So it's a conscious state of wholeness. It's a more conscious state. Right.
What we're talking about here, I think, is the transcendent function. That what redeems this is an awareness of the something greater, so that ego and the unconscious, including all your shadow, have a meeting. They have a sense of duality, but connection and a kind of unity of opposites that Jung called the transcendent function.
That arises almost out of grace, right? You can't make that happen. And I think the same thing is true for redemption, that redemption usually arises out of an act of grace, whether it's, you know, the bishop in Les Miserables, you know, just conferring that generosity of spirit onto poor Jean Valjean, or, you know, what my experience, it felt like an experience of grace. It's like, oh my God, the sponge wipes the mud right off. Who knew?
Well, and isn't that perfect, though, that we experience those moments of grace in your mother saying, don't worry about the wall, the bishop in Les Miserables saying, being that agent as the Redeemer, I gave him those candlesticks. And then eventually one hopes that it will happen within and not through an external mediator.
Yeah. And of course, that's where I'm imagining my young client needs to go, is to find self-forgiveness and self-compassion and self-acceptance.
And I find myself in a certain kind of tension thinking back to the cleverness of Les Miserables. So we have Jean Valjean, and he's been caught stealing. There's a tremendous amount of tension inside of him. Perhaps there's a moral conflict we don't know, but we know at least he's afraid of going back to jail, being hurt and being caught. So on one level, forgiveness, can be just the relieving of a certain anxiety in another person, which is basically, I'm not going to personally seek retribution. I'm going to forgive the debt of you stealing from me. Now, in the cleverness of the story, that action so exemplifies such a higher level of functioning that we can then imagine that set in motion a kind of model inside of him of forgiving and being forgiven and a kind of moral value. But I have to say that often in real life, simply giving people a free pass doesn't often lead to transformation.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that what was it about my experience as a child that fit into the archetype of redemption and burned itself into my brain for whatever reason that particular day. There probably were 200 other times that similar things happened that didn't have any kind of impact on me in that way.
Or it became a kind of myth inside of you years later as you reflected on it. But I think that the Catholic Church often had a little bit more of a serious idea about it than, let's say, modern churches, where redemption happens because you just make a declaration of, please take this away. Jesus magically comes down and you feel relieved of tension around the conflict. But in the early Catholic Church and in many other religions, that the work of redemption was actually a laborious alchemical process of separating the subtle from the gross, and that we've often used the term soul building, that it's this incremental grabbing of projection, of splitting and pulling it back and working it and working it and working it. It's like a forge where things are being hammered. So what I really want to differentiate is that I don't think the deep initiatic redemption you were talking about happens just by feeling a relief that no one's going to be coming after you like a harpy.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think that, we're sort of talking about two potential ways that redemption can happen. One is through an act of grace, and another would be through great suffering.
I don't think those two things are necessarily in any kind of opposition.
I agree.
It's a whole issue around discernment of, when between human beings, of when are you giving somebody a free pass and letting them off the hook, and when is it an act of grace that can be perceived by that person, as in Les Miserables. And if I may make the analogy, hopefully the analytic consulting room and the therapeutic process combines those two aspects of an interpersonal human relational context that in itself affords our client or an analysand to find something deep within himself or herself that is interior, that he or she can really experience and know and own, that will be an initiation and be transformative and redemptive.
Yeah, that's really great, Deb. I think that what happens to Jean Valjean actually is akin to a conversion experience, and that the bishop's compassion and forgiveness does this thing that we've been talking about, puts him in touch with something transcendent. And that is the nature of redemption, is that the ego is relativized and it has a new relationship with something that's transcendent.
And I think that's true, but it rises out of holding of tension, not relieving of tension. Mm-hmm. That we know about the transcendent function is that a conflict has to emerge, and the conflict has to be tolerated as well as one can. And the more the conscious conflict is tolerated, it kicks in the transcendent function. And the grace, as you were saying, Deb, is that something above us graces us with a symbol that relieves the tension, versus, let's say, a social pass on a faux pas, which doesn't necessarily give us a symbol, but might give us some relief so we can sleep well.
I want to round this out with a quick discussion of a fairy tale, if that's okay. It's a German fairy tale called The Black Princess. And if I can summarize it really quickly, there's a childless couple. The queen really wants a baby. She goes and she prays to the statue, I believe, of Mary on one side of the bridge. She doesn't get pregnant. So there's a statue of Lucifer on the other side of the bridge. She goes back and she prays to that. And wouldn't you know it, she gets pregnant. She gives birth to a coal-black daughter who grows up to adulthood in some ridiculously short span of time, like a few hours or something, and then says that she's, going to die and be laid to rest in the cathedral, and that she will need to be redeemed from that state by having a man set watch in the temple, in the cathedral. I think I'm mostly getting it right.
Every night. So they do this. They lay her to rest, and they have a soldier come and stand guard at night. And in the morning, they find him just torn limb from limb, bloody, horrible violence. This happens again and again and again, and all these men are getting killed every night. And then our hero comes along, Rudolph, and he is convinced to give it a try, but he has some contact with a zither player who tells him what to do. And there are various things that he needs to do each night to escape her wrath. And the very last night, I think there's 3 nights that he does it. The very last night, what he is told to do is to lie down in the crypt as on a bier with his arms crossed over his chest, and just to lie down as if dead while she rages around him. And she's trying to get to him, and she's screaming and cursing and in a fury, and he just has to remain as if dead. And then the following morning, they come into the cathedral, and there she is. He's alive, and she's a beautiful Snow White maiden, and she's redeemed, and they get married and live happily ever after, and that kind of thing. So there's a way that this is such a rich, complicated fairy tale. We're not going to be able to totally do it justice, but there is a way that, again, we're dealing with shadow, right? And the queen is open to the shadow. She's willing to pray to Lucifer. And I think that oftentimes new life does come to us through the shadow. But then it has to be redeemed. And there's a way that this fairy tale is a big cultural statement embedded in it, because the feminine in Western culture is largely tangled up in shadow. I mean, there's a lot about the feminine that has been relegated to the shadow in our culture. Well, I'm thinking about how we do have to encounter shadow, and yet, of course, the queen, and she's not alone as a fairy tale motif, doesn't do what she's told to do. She prays to Lucifer in this case. She transgresses in order to get what she wants, which is a baby. And our soldier, Rudolph, is a classic dumbling. He doesn't want the task of standing guard. Everybody in the whole kingdom knows what's been happening. Every day the bloody remains of some poor sod are taken out of the church. And each time he wants to desert. And the zither player, sort of the wise old man, wisdom figure in the tale, tells him, no, don't do it. But isn't that exactly like our egos of, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go there.
I don't want to have to suffer this.
Oh.
Take this cup away from me.
Yeah, forget about it. And he goes back time after time. I think it brings up for me how important it is just to bear it, to bear the fear, the dread. And each night he protects himself by making symbols or appealing to God, basically.
But the last night, the transformative night, and the night that brings about the redemption, the answer is to submit and surrender. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is one of the key points in the tale, and why I wanted to bring it forward, that there is a way that the redemptive movement is for the ego to submit.
And also to submit to the self. Mm-hmm. To something greater, that I can't do this. I simply have to lie here and hope. And we don't know in that moment. It's not written anywhere that it's, this is not transactional. Hey, I know, I'll lie there and I'll do this, and then, God will come, or the self will appear and everything will be fine. We never really know.
We never really know. And I wonder if that's a good place to switch to a dream.
Yes.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
So here's a dream. A male, 24 years old, a student, writes, "In my dream, my mom and I are in the backyard that is adjacent to a street. We see Jimmy Fallon walking over to us with a baby's car seat held over his head. Jimmy greets us and my mom asks if she could see the baby. So Jimmy lowers the car seat, sets it on the ground, and reveals that the car seat is filled with this orange liquid that completely submerges the baby. My mom is very excited to see the baby, and Jimmy smiles at her excitement. I then panic and ask them if they can't see the baby is drowning. Although I brought it to their attention, they didn't seem very worried, and I wound up tipping the car seat over to discard the liquid." This fellow gives us a bit of context. He writes that he's in his second semester of junior year, which had just started. In the dream, he says that he was feeling confusion and panic, and adds that he wants to say the orange liquid was some kind of beverage, but doesn't feel quite sure about that.
So we've got the baby and the orange soda. One of the things that I really like about this dream is it highlights this issue that always comes up is, what do we make of the attitude of the dream ego? And there is this rule of thumb that says the least trustworthy attitude in a dream is that of the dream ego. So in this dream, the dreamer thinks it's a problem that the baby is in the orange liquid. And we really don't know for sure what is true. We don't know if it's a problem for the baby, but given our adage, we might begin by assuming that it's really fine that the baby is in orange liquid because the dream ego's worried about it, but that's the conscious standpoint. The unconscious may feel differently about it.
Yes, that often the deep part of the psyche, the self, is offering a medicine, and sometimes the medicine is so symbolic that if it's taken literally, it is horrifying. But if we lift out of that naturalistic attitude and think about it more abstractly.
And even Joseph, I mean, I like how you put that the self is offering a medicine. Sometimes the medicine that the self offers feels not just symbolically, but actually really threatening to the ego. I mean, for example, I'm just going to make something up. Let's say that the ego's intention is to go to law school, and the self conspires to make sure that you don't get in. And to the ego, you're like, oh no, but the self is like, no, you're not supposed to go to law school.
Yeah, it'll really be awful. But I want to start just from the beginning, and there's something which I think is very potent in a young man's psyche. He's 24, is that mom and I, the mother complex and the dream ego are together, and that evokes the baby. And this is a developmental struggle that most young men are involved in, particularly being in college where they're in transition. Many people are still going home during the spring holidays, and you're returning to the world of the mother, the world of being a kid. and then you're oscillating to being independent and responsible. But the dream here at the start of the year is mother and son are together, and two figures then pop out of that relationship. One is the trickster, and one is the baby. And that's an interesting cast of characters that show up when the mother is looming large.
And they also show up in the shadow function, which is indicated they're being in the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
They're not in the front yard. In the backyard, dream ego and mother complex are there, giving rise to Jimmy Fallon, who's holding a baby's car seat over his head. So I have this very clear visual image of what would it take to see Jimmy Fallon literally holding a car seat high above of this kind of elevated position that has kind of dual possibilities inherent in it. One is it's a kind of show-offy, grandiose gesture that from, if we saw this on the street, we would think, oh my gosh, that's not safe. What is he doing? But I wonder if, on the other hand, there is something that is like holding something sacred on high of the new thing, the new being.
Some kind of benediction or something.
And in ceremonial kinds of rituals, we hold the sacred thing on high. We hold it up.
I think that I resonate with that, but also I'm thinking that a car seat is generally to keep a baby safe and contained. I mean, that's why we now have laws. I mean, I remember being like 3 years old and just strapped into a belt buckle around my waist, as we were driving around in 1964. But now kids are really packed in. And yet the contradistinction is here, the baby seat is, held over the head. So the baby is actually exposed, or ostensibly would be exposed to all of the elements, and in fact not kept safe. So there's this paradox of being strapped in and exposed, which also is a very interesting developmental process for a kid. He's kind of still strapped in to the parental support. Maybe they're paying for a lot of things. He still is their kid, but he's also being exposed to the environment and to a lot of things.
It's interesting, sort of, what does this baby mean, Joseph? And you had this great point about this kind of constellates out of the mother-son relationship. There is some new life or new attitude. And as we know, the child archetype is an enormous archetype. And one of the aspects of the child archetype is its vulnerability. And a new attitude in the psyche always has this kind of vulnerability. It's interesting that it's the mother who's really excited to see the baby. And, that's interesting that the mother complex can kind of tolerate and enjoy this new life without feeling overly concerned about it. But to the standpoint of the dream ego, it is imperiled, as children often are in myths and fairy tales. Part of the mythologem of the sacred infant is that he or she is endangered, in great peril.
So the mother principal is excited about the baby and wants to see this new baby. And Jimmy, our trickster comic, basically accedes and says, sure. Now it's grounded. He sets the car seat on the ground. And then we have a car seat filled with orange liquid that completely submerges the baby. So this is actually wouldn't even be possible in real life, but here it is as an image in the dream. And all I could think about was orangeade or orange soda or something, something sort of sticky and sweet. I couldn't imagine what other orange juice. It's a sort of really arresting and interesting image, but it has this sort of solar sun-like quality to it.
And it also feels kind of vaguely alchemical, right? Something's cooking in that, bath. It's sort of, or maybe an image of kind of amniotic fluid or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also wondering if it's a symbol of dissolution. In some alchemical substances, there's something called the orange chrome or the chrome orange, which is actually taken when lead is exposed to a certain kind of alkaline substance, which begins to dissolve it. So we could also imagine that the baby represents a kind of stuck, leaden, passive, childlike part of him or attitude, which is being exposed to a corrosive element, kind of dissolving it down into a kind of an orangey goo.
Ooh, that's great. That's great.
Maybe, it's kind of a shocking medicine. But interestingly, if that's true, the mother is kind of delighted.
Yes.
And that might be a revelation like, mom, literally the bio mom, as well as the inner mom are like, wow, the baby's dissolving. Woo! Yes, I'm free. I don't need to.
This is another indicator of that inherent ambivalence here in the dream of, is it good? Is it bad? Holding the baby up over Jimmy Fallon's head, is it exalting something, or is it reckless endangerment? Is this orange liquid a corrosive substance, or is it kind of a solar amniotic fluid? We don't know.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
The alchemists often talk about drowning things in fluids. And the drowning often is that it doesn't maintain its integrity and begins to fall apart.
Yeah, so is it solutio or coagulatio? We don't know what alchemical operation we're in. I want to bring in a mythologic parallel, which occurred to me, which is Demeter with the infant Demophoon. After her daughter is carried away by Hades, Demeter wanders the earth and looks for her daughter and all this kinds of, she goes through a grieving process. And as part of that, she disguises herself as an old woman and hires herself out to a wealthy family in Eleusis as a nursemaid to a young boy named Demophoon. And the Homeric hymn to Demeter is so beautiful and poetic at this point, where she talks about, holding him on her fragrant lap and nurturing him with ambrosia. And then she sets about trying to make him immortal, to do that, she needs to burn away his mortality. And so at night, she banks him in the fire like a log. So she places him in the fire every night. And I guess this is a process that takes a few days or something. Anyway, finally, one night, the mother walks in and sees her baby in the fire and shrieks, as one would. And that's at the point when Demeter reveals herself to be the goddess and says, now look what you've done. You've ruined this. He was going to be immortal, but now he's not. So it's that dual stance, Deb, that you picked up on really beautifully, the ambivalence from Demeter's perspective. She's not doing anything destructive, in fact, quite the contrary. But from the mortal perspective, it looks really destructive. So which side are we on here? Where are we?
And if I step back and purely psychologically, the archetypal mother wants the archetypal baby to always be a baby, to be immutable and eternal, just as it is. The biological mother, it's threatening to see your baby roasted, but on another level, the biological mother may not want that baby to be an eternal baby. That actually there may be some other potentials that would be more attractive if they were to emerge.
And there's something in this part of the Demeter myth that carries that same ambivalence of, first of all, this is a human baby. And what is Demeter really up to here? She's missing her daughter, and maybe she's imposing something that is not really part of the human story into which Demophoon has been born.
Yeah, it's in the interest of stasis, isn't it, to make him immortal?
Seems to be, unchanging. So the other thing I want to do is come back to the dream, is that the only ambivalence is in the ego. That Jimmy Fallon seems fine with it, I suppose. The mother's like, ooh, look, a liquid baby. And it's the ego that's like a liquefied baby or a drowning baby or an inert baby. That can't be allowed to happen. So I think the ambivalence inside of a lot of young men, and I remember being like this, I actually had this experience. The first time, it was just so onerous that I couldn't go home for Christmas. I had just too much going on. And I finally called up my sister and my mom, and I'm like, listen, I just can't come home for Christmas. It's too much. And they all were like, okay. And I was like, what? It's okay. In myself. And I'm like, okay. Slowly putting the phone back on the ringer. It seemed like a great triumph of individuation, but there was another side to it.
Yeah.
The baby's dissolving, but he's not sure that that's a great idea.
Well, either it's dissolving or it's growing, and we just don't know which one. I think we just don't know, and there might be a way in which it's both true, that something's dissolving and something new is taking shape. I would be curious, if I had this dreamer, about how it felt to pour out the liquid, because in a way,
and what was left.
Yeah, what was left, because in a way he's kind of doing the same thing that the baby's mother did in the myth, is, interrupting some process.
He's aborting the process.
Yeah, and we don't exactly know what process he's aborting, but I think that likely this is some process in the unconscious that needs to happen, that feels disconcerting to the ego.
And I'm building on your point, Lisa, that this orange liquid, he says in his comments, he thinks it's some kind of beverage, but he's not sure. And I would be very curious as to, if you're tipping out a beverage, what has he been drinking that now may need to be tipped out in order to reveal something new? And is that a process where he's aborting something, or exactly what does that mean in his own life? Where is that happening in his life, or how is it happening?
And if this young man were in my practice, the attitude I might encourage is to observe rather than react. That if one were to come to a moment like this, internally or externally, to become kind of a psychological scientist or a spiritual scientist, and observe the orange liquid, before you kind of just stop the experiment, to kind of just see what's cooking in the middle of all this stuff. And then after more information, maybe you'll decide if any action is needed.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show, and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.